case, welcome and good evening. We would like to begin our Disability Identity, Culture, and Community event this evening with a recognition that our event is being broadcast from the unceded and traditional homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation and the land of the Norwottuck community. So we begin with offering our gratitude for the nearby waters and lands, including the Quiniqua, or the southern portion of what is now called the Connecticut River. And we recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend upon to sustain life and well-being. My name is Elodie Carell, and I will be your host for this evening's presentation on disability experiences in higher education. I am an undergraduate student studying psychology and disability studies at UMass. I am also a member of the Alliance Against Ableism and the vice president of the Disability Culture Club. To make this event more inclusive, each panelist, as well as our moderator, will provide a visual self-description during their introductions. As I mentioned before, my name is Elodie Carell. I am a white, feminine presenting individual in my early 20s with brown hair that hits at about my shoulders and bangs cut straight across about where my eyebrows are. I am wearing a white collared shirt with a black square pattern on it and a gray sweater over my shirt. I am sitting halfway in front of a door that has like a clear panel and halfway behind a gray wall. I identify as disabled. This evening's presentation on the disability experiences in higher education is the second event in a 4-part series inspired by a campus climate improvement grant from the University of Massachusetts Amherst's Office of Equity and Inclusion. The 2021-2022 event series was made possible by additional funding and support provided by the UMass History Department, the College of Education, Disability Services, the University of Massachusetts Allies for Illness and Disability Access, or UMAIDA, UMass Information Technology, the Du Bois Library Assistive Technology Center, the Stonewall Center, and the Bachelor's Degree in Individual Concentration, or BDIC, Program Office. In addition to our event this evening, we will be hosting one additional speaker on February 16th of 2022, which will be moderated by Dr. Toussaint Loisier, an assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst, and featuring Dr. Liat Ben-Moshe, who will discuss her new book entitled Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization, and Prison Abolition. The final event in our series will be a panel discussion that focuses on disability activism and will take place on April 26th of 2022. Please be on the lookout for posters and emails inviting you to those two events. Now, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our moderator for this event. Dr. Ashley Woodman is the Director of the Developmental Disabilities and Human Services Specialization at UMass Amherst. She is a PhD in Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology from Boston College. She has completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before starting her faculty position at UMass in 2014. Her research and teaching focuses on life course outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. She recently collaborated with researchers at the Center for Student Success at UMass to investigate outcomes for students with disabilities at colleges and universities across Massachusetts. She has lived experience as a disabled person navigating higher education.
Thank you, Elodie, and welcome everyone. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. I will ask them to share their names, pronouns, position at UMass, visual self-description, and what brings them to the panel today. So we'll start with Catherine.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Catherine McCarran. I also go by Kat. My pronouns are she, her, hers. At UMass, I was a former undergraduate student. I graduated in 2019. And now I am a graduate student. I am finishing up my master's and starting my PhD in neuroscience at UMass. My visual description, I am a biracial, Asian and white, feminine looking person with big, round, dark glasses. I also have long, dark brown hair and pink hair mixture. And I am in my office with tan walls behind me and a red Inuyasha poster and a chair behind me as well. And what brought me here, I am an openly autistic and chronically ill student, and I have navigated UMass since my undergraduate as an openly disabled student and still navigate this space as a disabled person today. So thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you, Kat. Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia Maraji. I use she, they pronouns. I am a junior English major from Texas. And in addition to being the president of the Disability Culture Club, I am also involved with the Iranian Student Association. I am an Asian woman with long black hair. Behind me is the wall of my dorm. It's a white color. And as for what brought me here, I identify as disabled.
Thank you. Gail?
Hi, my name is Gail Gunn, and I am the Information Services Coordinator and Senior Programmer Analyst for University Advancement, where I have worked for 24 years at UMass Amherst. For college, I went to Boston College and got my bachelor's degree in sociology. I use she/her pronouns, and I am a middle-aged woman with brown and gray, almost shoulder length hair. For the first half of my life, what brings me here is for the first half of my life, I could see normally 20/20 without the assistance of glasses. And for the second half of my life, I am completely blind with no light perception. I lost my sight gradually over 11 years while I worked at MIT.
Thank you, Gail. Maya?
Hello, my name is Maya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently in my fourth year at UMass as a communications major. I'm currently wearing a navy beanie with a dark shawl, it's red, blue, and a hoodie that is blue, and it says I'm a roll with it and has sun and clouds because those are my favorite things. Behind me is my dorm, which is white walls, some fairy lights, and a green tapestry. And I am here today on this panel because I am a disabled student. I joined UMass in an able body, and 2 years ago, I developed a disability that now requires me to use a wheelchair full-time. And I also recently learned that I am autistic, and so I'm navigating this space as a physically impaired, but also mentally disabled individual. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Cook, my sign name. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor in the geosciences department. My research is on earthquake mechanics, and I like to say I study earthquakes in Southern California from the safety of Massachusetts. In my service work includes disability advocacy. I'm on the steering committee of UMass, which was mentioned earlier, and I also co-direct the Mind Hears, a blog for deaf and hard of hearing students with Anna Sakaido from biology. I'll probably tell you more about that later. My visual description is I'm a middle-aged white woman with graying brown hair and glasses in my home office. I have blue glitter hearing aids that you probably can't see in Zoom, but maybe you'll get to see in person someday. And the visual description of my sign name is it's an M on top of a closed fist down. It means M on the rock, like geologist that I am.
Thank you so much. I was so excited to introduce our panelists that I skipped over my own visual self-description and pronouns. My apologies. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a faculty member at UMass, as Elodie mentioned, and I have brown and gray hair past my shoulders. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm in my, I'm hiding from my children in my basement, which has guitars on the back on the wall, and no, they are not mine, and I don't know how to play them. So without further ado, let's get started with our questions. So the first question is, what has your experience with disability on campus been like? So we'll start with that question with Michelle.
Yeah, it's interesting as a faculty member, while 20% of the working age adult population has disability, studies show that only 4% of faculty have disabilities. So there's a real strong underrepresentation of disability among faculty, and several factors play into this. One is the pretty weak support for faculty in terms of getting accommodations. Until a few years ago, there was no office that provided faculty accommodation. Just like with students, when they need accommodation for classes, they'll go to disability services. Disability services does not serve staff. It does not serve faculty. So until a few years ago, we had to arrange accommodations with department heads and negotiate that with that department head. Department heads change every 3 years. So every 3 years or so, you'd have to negotiate with a new person and sort of educate them about the social and cultural models of disability and how to drift away from the deficit model of disability. So there was a lot of pressure on faculty to basically negotiate their accommodation. And the other part of that is for lecturers and untenured faculty, they're put in particularly vulnerable situations because they're negotiating accommodations with their department head, who then has a lot of control over whether they'll get promoted to tenure, whether their contracts will be renewed. So there's a big power imbalance that sort of influences those negotiations. The other factor at the same time, so at the same time that there's less support for accommodation, the other factor for faculty is what we call academic ableism. And Jay Dolmage says that really well in his book titled Academic Ableism. He says that academia valorizes valorizes perfection. And in academia, professors are sort of cast as these hero experts that are ideal and perfect. And so when a faculty has a disability, it sort of is disruptive to that ideal. And while we can think about accommodating students in the classroom, and that's increasingly part of instructor training, is to provide inclusive classrooms, when we start to talk about how to accommodate disabled instructors, the conversation often sort of stops. No one knows quite what to do. And there's this sort of disconnect with that. And so the combination of lack of support and this sort of pressure to be this expert, sometimes people might feel that disclosing their disabilities might erode their credibility, especially if their expertise is outside of disability studies or deaf studies. That disability might erode their credibility. So it's really no wonder that a lot of faculty just don't disclose their disabilities, because there's not support for it in the system, and there's a vulnerability for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. I wondered if Gail, if you wanted to add anything more to that as another longtime employee of UMass.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I think I started here in 1997, and I think I was fortunate to come here from working at MIT, because people assume that if you work at MIT, you're smart enough to have gone to MIT, and I don't necessarily think that's true, but I think it helped me get my job. Fortunately, you know, I had a person hire me that just asked the appropriate questions, because when you walk in a room with a guide dog, your disability is obvious. And it's interesting the way you're spoken to from the get-go when you have an obvious disability. It's interesting because often people will speak very slowly and loudly to me because I am blind. And it's just sort of a gut instinct, I guess. And so over the years, I mean, recently, a lot more has been done, as you just noted, with an office to support faculty and staff with disabilities. Previously, I was using the general disability services that students use, because I'm not afraid to ask loudly for the things I need. And my department was very good about supporting the software that I need. But I guess the one point I'd like to make is that it would be really nice if what you needed to make you successful at your job when you have a disability wasn't treated as an afterthought. It would be so much more useful if you would just ask what you need and somebody was happy to provide it.
Thank you, Gail. Kat, as someone who has experienced UMass in a number of different capacities, and you've been advocating for your rights for several years now, I want to turn to you and see what else you might have to add to that.
Yeah, I guess as a student, I had a bit of an upper hand coming in. I had a really good support team in high school that actually offered me transition services with my IEP, which I know is very uncommon. So I was already registered with disability services before I started my first semester as a freshman, or first year, sorry. And that set me up for a bit of a easier transition than others that I know that are disabled. I think for me, undergraduate was in some ways easier than graduate school, but in some ways harder as well. It's the challenge, I think, of those that do choose to live in a dorm style living. It's sometimes the accommodations that you require. For instance, I require having air conditioning. I have a heat sensitivity due to my illness, and that was incredibly hard to get. And I kept getting comments from the facilities managers saying, this is my first time doing this. We've never done this before. Like every single time I got one installed. And it made me feel kind of stressed and kind of like guilty to like make somebody do something for me. But at the same time, I knew this is my right. Like I need this to live, or else I'm going to constantly have seizures or pass out because it's too hot. So it was really important for me. And navigating, I've heard undergraduate dorm style living can be a huge challenge for a lot of people because the buildings can only change so much. And sometimes like Gail said, the accommodations are an afterthought a lot of the time. It's, oh, you can't do something? Okay, we'll work on that, but it might take a couple months or a year to get you access to that thing. So you have to wait and continue to not have access to that thing. And I think it's unfortunate that there aren't a lot of other living accommodations, unfortunately, in this area that are also accommodating. So transitioning from undergraduate to graduate school was interesting. Instead of the regular bringing my accommodation letter to a professor, talking to them about it, I was talking one-on-one with a professor in a class of 10 people, and typically a professor that was in my program and also was probably part of my admissions process as well, because my program is very small. So in some ways it was easier because I came into school, I think graduate school, being a lot more proud of being disabled, knowing more of who I was, and more able to be a self-advocate. So I think in that way, it made graduate school easier for me, but I still ran into challenges of being one of the few disabled people in the space, or few, I guess, openly disabled, and that is everybody's choice to pick whether or not they'd like to disclose. But typically, I get reactions of shock when I tell people I'm autistic or I'm actually physically disabled. I would like to use that chair because I can't stand anymore. And when you're at a poster session and you're presenting your research, typically everybody stands for hours. And it seems a little disrespectful to sit and present your research when you're at a poster and you're a first-year PhD student. So I recently navigated that, and that was really tough. But most of the people, luckily, in my program know that I am physically disabled. I will need to sit at some points. So there are pros and cons to both. I'm lucky that my accommodations carried over because I stayed at the same university. So I didn't have to go through the self-advocacy step again of like trying to get accommodations a second time. But it requires a lot of effort, a lot of self-advocacy, and a lot of emotional vulnerability to share these things with your supervisor, your professors, your program. And it can be hard because sometimes the reactions are ignorant, and sometimes they're wonderful and you don't know what you're going to get. So I'm very lucky, I think, to be in a very accessible space compared to other spaces around me. But I know that there are still some challenges that we need to get over.
Thank you so much, Kat. Julia, I wonder if you want to share a bit about your experiences here at UMass.
Great. So my experience with disability on campus has been, for the most part, pretty good, and especially with Disability Culture Club, especially. It has been fantastic to have this space where like people like myself and other people with disabilities can come together and kind of, you know, share our experiences with, well, disability on campus. So that's been fantastic for me. And in addition to that, I would say that overall, I think this is something that I consider myself very lucky for, is that I had a like supportive team of medical professionals that were willing to, you know, grant me the proper documentation I needed to receive accommodations, and that alone has been huge for my academic success. So again, overall, drawing from a variety of different sources, I would say that my experience with disability has been largely a good one.
Great, thank you. And Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya, and I have some context to my story that is important for my experience. I came into UMass as an able-bodied freshman, so physical access barriers were not something that was part of my situation up until 2 years ago when I started using a wheelchair part-time. My disability progressed, then COVID happened, so I was at home. And then coming back on campus this semester, with my disability being the most significant it's been, with my support needs being the highest, I was able to move into the dorms a week earlier than everyone else. And during that 1 week, during my 4th year of college, after finishing organic chemistry and all that stuff, I have never wanted to drop out more in my entire life, for the sole factor of the numerous amount of access barriers that are all over campus. I was having breakdowns and crying every single day because I could not get into buildings due to broken door openers or the lack of door openers. There were potholes and cracks and just tiny little features all over campus that my wheelchair just could not handle. And that's been a very frustrating and difficult process. And then the first week of classes started, but 3 out of 4 of my classes were not wheelchair accessible, and I just was not able to go, which further added to the struggles and frustrations of being on campus. And so coming from the perspective of someone who is familiar with the layout of UMass, who is also comfortable advocating for myself, I am almost a full-time disability advocate at this point. For me to be in this situation and feel the need to drop out, I can't possibly imagine coming into UMass as a freshman with a similar level of disability and feeling welcomed here. The physical layout of campus screams, "You do not belong here." When I go to the digital media lab and I try to use the recording studios for podcasts or songs or things like that, none of the soundproof booths are accessible to me. And I brought that up months ago and they're still not accessible to me. Or another example, the campus pools. I recently had an interest in trying a campus pool, and I was told by my friends, none of them have lifts for disabled individuals. And so there are numerous locations all across campus that are physically inaccessible, and they'll make modifications. They'll give you different supports and different options. They'll move things to different buildings. But this comes back to the whole idea of separate is not equal. So I've had a rather mixed experience with my disability on campus. For example, my dorm is decently accessible for my support needs, but a lot of my accommodations that I requested weren't here when I first moved in. My classes are somewhat accessible. I have note takers, but a lot of my accommodations still have not been put in. And so as other people have mentioned, it's nice having the communities that are available. It's good having the supports in place that we can access, but it also should not be such a fight for every single thing that we need, and is also part of our rights by the ADA, the law. And so I would love to see more emphasis and more focus put on making resources easily accessible, making these resources put at the front of everything rather than the afterthought, because our access needs and our experiences are almost always an afterthought, and that needs to change.
Thank you so much. I won't be asking every person on the panel to answer each question, but I felt like that first question was important to hear everyone's perspective. So moving on, we're going to talk about the disability community experienced on campus. So how do you experience the disability community both on and off campus? So Julia, I'd like to start with you. You mentioned the Disability Culture Club. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your experience with the disability community?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of my experience with the disability community has been via the Disability Culture Club, and also to a lesser extent the Assistive Technology Center. Yeah, it's again been fantastic to have this dedicated space where we can come together to discuss, important aspects of disability culture, disability history, people's various experiences on this campus as disabled people, and to really begin to explore these ideas that related to disability justice and also disability as an identity. And again, with the Assistive Technology Center, it's been really good knowing that there is like a physical space where disabled people can go, and it functions quite like a cultural center for me, at least. And I really think that we need to see more efforts made across campus to really bring disability culture and discussions of it into the more mainstream diversity discussions.
Great, thank you. And Michelle, as someone who is at the front of the classroom teaching, I wondered if you could kind of follow up on Julia's comments about mainstreaming disability. But you can also answer the more direct question of the experience of the disability community, both on and off campus as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I definitely relate to what Julia said in terms of finding community and having a place on campus that is a community space is incredibly valuable for reducing the isolation that a lot of folks can feel. And speaking from the perspective of faculty, you know, when I started as a faculty member, there were no deaf or hard of hearing faculty that I could go to and say, how do I manage classes? How do I get through faculty meeting and possibly follow the discussion? Like, I had to kind of invent strategies as I went. And so having more mechanisms to sort of share strategies and resources, and just having places that are safe to go, wow, this is not working for me, and just be safe spaces to vent is also really valuable. And I should say that I'm really fortunate to have teamed up with Anna Sakedo in biology, who's also hard of hearing, and we've set up this blog that called The Mind Hears, which was specifically for recognizing that a lot of people at institutions that predominantly serve hearing people, that folks with hearing loss are often isolated, and there's lots of folks all around the world who are trying to figure out how to navigate faculty meetings and how to navigate large, 200-person classrooms, and you're standing at the front, someone asks a question, you have no idea what they said, those kinds of situations. And so by putting this blog together and having folks write about their shared experiencing, we're hoping to, at least off campus, start to reduce that isolation. And so I can see these efforts happening off campus, also efforts happening on campus. I think finding our people, comparing notes is really valuable for empowerment, for mentoring, for yes, all of that.
Thank you. I want to jump to Kat, because as an undergraduate, you participated in a neurodiverse student peer mentoring group before the Alliance Against Ableism even existed. So I thought maybe you could start with a little bit about that experience, getting that off the ground, but also speak to your experience with the disability community broadly as an undergraduate and graduate student.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this. I think I want to say my senior year, Dr. Ashley Woodman invited me to speak on a panel of other disabled students, and for an event for the program that she runs at UMass. And at that program, me and another student, as well as Ashley and somebody else in a UMass staff member, came together and applied for a campus climate grant. And we were awarded the campus climate grant, I believe, was it 2018 or 2019? And we started the UMass neurodiverse community. And that I think we had, about 3 to 5 consistent members. Though it was really hard to keep up. I think it was really hard to, at the time, navigate social media and navigate advertising and all those challenges. And I am no communication major person, so it was a really struggle. And being autistic, I think I struggled a lot with trying to reach out more because now I was putting myself out there. But from the club and a few other people that I knew in the community, afterwards, the Alliance Against Ableism was started. And then Catherine, who has since passed, was a wonderful member of our community and started the Disability Culture Club about the time that I was graduating. And I was graduating, but made sure my name was on the list so that the club could continue to exist, because there was a few times where I believe the club was at risk of not having enough members. So I made sure my name was on there, even though I wasn't technically a student anymore. And now the Disability Culture Club is amazing, and I really want to come. I haven't had time, but I really want to. And the Alliance Against Ableism is also amazing and super strong. And I'm very, very happy to see that there's been so much progress. I think when I was graduating, it was really hard to ensure that there would be something and to make it stronger, even though I wasn't a student and my grandmother was in hospice, was navigating my own health issues. But I'm so happy and so relieved to see that much progress was made in just a few years. It gave me a lot of hope. And then coming back as a student, it made me really excited to be able to possibly be a part of those communities again. But unfortunately, my health has been on the decline lately. So hopefully when that subsides, I will be able to join again. But yeah, I'm really happy about it.
Thank you. Maya, do you have anything to add about your experience of the disability community?
Hi, yes, Maya speaking. Unfortunately, this semester between my health and school and other things in life, I also have not had very many opportunities to engage with the things that are currently available on campus, although I'm very excited for that. But in terms of community off campus, I have a few social media platforms where I focus a lot on disability advocacy and my experiences as a disabled person. And through that, I've connected to so many other amazing disabled individuals out there, and having connection to people who understand what it means to be disabled, who understands what it's like to experience ableism in all of the different ways that it exists constantly around us. It is really comforting, but also empowering to have people who can relate, but also who you can collaborate with and discuss, like, what can I personally do to help myself in this situation? What can I do to support you in your situation? And then what can we do as a whole for our community to hopefully move towards a better future for all of us? And so community, for whatever aspect of your identity, is extremely important.
Great, thank you. And we'll move on to the next question, and I'll ask Gail to respond first. Do you feel like the campus is a welcoming and inclusive space for the disability community? Why or why not?
Interesting question, isn't it? Wow. I really have to think about it. Since I've been here a really long time, obviously, when I came here and applied as a blind individual and applied for the job and got it, and that was the first time I applied for a job as a blind individual. And so that was extremely welcoming. Do I think that's the case throughout campus? No, I don't, only because when I look at the stats, I believe I am the only blind faculty staff member at UMass Amherst. So I guess that says something in itself. I'm not sure if it's because of, people's motivation to get full-time employment or to be hired, but it's the one thing that's worth saying is when you have a disability that makes you do things differently. And that's my favorite thing to say, that I am differently abled, not disabled, that most things I can do, I just have to figure out how I do them differently. But the one thing that's very true is I have to invest a lot more time in a full-time job to be able to accomplish the same things as people who are fully able. And some of that is because I haven't been offered the help. Some of it probably is because I'm stubborn and I want to prove that I am as good as anybody else that can see. But part of it is it's been difficult at UMass, even though it's such a large place, it is a very siloed place. So wouldn't it be great if you could go to one place and ask for the type of assistance you need, as opposed, to having to go to all these different places to try to figure it out.
Great, thank you. And we'll shift to Michelle. Do you feel like the campus is a welcome and inclusive space for the disability community?
I see, I've been here 20 plus years, so it's been here a while, like Gail, and I have noticed improvements. I think the university is really trying to make good steps. Having the accessible workplace centralized office has been a big step forward in terms of offering a way for faculty and staff to get accommodation through a centralized office, or at least a centralized office works with supervisors. They've also got the new employee resource group, the UMass, and the Disability Culture Club, Alliance Against Ableism. I think sort of the grassroots emergence of all these groups speaks to the community seeing the value of spaces for disabled voices and listening to disabled voices. I think we have a ways to go, but I see really good signs of sort of first steps.
Great, thank you. Julia, do you have anything you would like to share on that question?
I would say that while my experience has been one that has largely been positive, I would still not venture to say that that is the case for, every single disabled person that is involved with UMass. I think, as Maya was saying, there's obviously some huge barriers when it comes to obtaining full accessibility. And like a lot of people here have mentioned, I really do believe that in a lot of cases, it shows that our accommodations are being thought of more as like an afterthought, as opposed to something that is very much necessary for the well-being of a great number of students and faculty members here. So overall, I would have to say that there is certainly huge steps that still must be taken in order to truly say that this campus is welcoming and inclusive for all people who identify as disabled.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to kind of take the next step and ask the follow-up question: how could the campus climate be improved for people with disabilities? So Maya, we'll start with you.
Sorry, I had to sit up a little bit more. I think starting off, so our campus has a very long way to go in terms of being more accessible and more inclusive. And I think the first big step is the climate and the culture around disability. I think there needs to be a lot more discussions, especially amongst staff and faculty, about what it means to be disabled, what disabled experiences are like, and how to appropriately support, and honestly, how to interact with disabled people. For example, as Gail was mentioning, people will start talking extremely loud for no appropriate reason. And so having more of those discussions, because if you aren't actively, personally aware of your internalized ableism and how that can present itself in how you treat and interact with others, you are going to be ableist and treat others with ableism. And you need the awareness to not do that. So I think that's the first big step. And then the second step is having adequate and appropriate funding for disabled needs. Disabled students should not feel like their requests are extra work, that their requests are unnecessary. For example, Kat mentioned feeling a bit of stress when getting air conditioners installed. That is your right, that is your accommodation. And the fact that you felt stressed with it, as understandable as it is, it should not have been there. Or for example, for myself, I was denied an accommodation because it was too expensive when I really would have benefited from it. And now I have it, thankfully. But putting in appropriate funding to make every single building genuinely accessible, because UMass likes to say, you matter at UMass. We all matter, all of our experiences matter, and we deserve the same ease of access for everything. So appropriate funding for accessibility and adequate training and discussion around disability culture.
Great, thank you. Kat, how could the campus climate be improved for people with disabilities?
Yes, so I want to echo what everybody else said, and I'll speak kind of more on a perspective of research and science, because we are a Research One university. We have a lot of funding that goes towards scientific research. And as somebody in that field, I study neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. And even though we get a lot of funding in general for research, the buildings that are built, the new ones, they were not built necessarily with universal design implemented. And a universal design is a design in which would be already in advance accommodating for many individuals that are disabled, like already having the handicap buttons and already having different levels of lab benches and having enough space for wheelchairs in lab spaces, and offering wheelchair accessible desks, and not, make sure to keep up with those things as well. So as a scientist, I think it's interesting that as much as people in science like myself study people with disabilities and diseases that can cause disabilities, sometimes, a lot of times, it isn't implemented actually in that space, because I feel as though outside of UMass, just in general, the thought is that disabled individuals are not scientists, can't be scientists, cannot be academics. So often, I've noticed there's a handicap button to get into my building, which is brand new, but there is no handicap button to get into my actual lab space. That door is a heavy one. And I know Maya knows because it's tough to navigate. So with all these things in mind, there are actual recommendations that I think UMass should use that have been used in other lab spaces that are universal design in nature, and that could be amazing and already open the door for students who are interested, disabled students that are interested in research that would like to. Because if you get a tour of a lab that isn't accessible, already you're not going to want to work there. And already that's another opportunity you don't get in that field. And I now in the field can see the lack of representation of disabled individuals in research. And that's also reflected in the grants that they offer as well. There's not a lot offered specifically for disabled scientists. So I think UMass can do better. And I agree with Maya in reallocating some of the research funding to also make the actual research spaces more accessible if that's possible. Because we keep building brand new buildings, but a lot of them are not universal design. And that would be amazing if we could implement those.
Thank you. Gail, could you speak to how the campus climate could be improved for people with disabilities? Gail, we cannot hear you. If you could unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I think everybody said, a large part of it with funding, right? Funding needs to be allocated and there. So when it is asked for, there's actually, some money to be taken for that purpose. And for, for the Office for Faculty Staff Disability Support now is a good start, but they are overwhelmed with, particularly with COVID, but even otherwise, they're overwhelmed with the staff they have and trying to handle the situations appropriately in a good amount of time. I think, people with disabilities learn to really be their own advocates. And I think often, and others of the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, people are so hesitant to ask a person with a disability about their disability or what they can do to help in a constructive way. And I think that whole barrier needs to be broken so that, you know, people feel free to ask appropriate questions. I mean, I've always said myself, and it's my belief, and I'm not representing every disabled person, but there is no bad question if your intent is good. But you'll see that when, you know, a child asks me if I'm blind, their parents will say, shh, don't ask, you know, and it shouldn't be something that you can't speak about. I think that's the first step to making, you know, an accepting community for one and all, and not just accepting for disabled people separately.
Great, thank you for that. And finally, for this question, Michelle, how could the campus climate be improved for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I want to touch on two aspects. One, which relates to what Gail was saying, is when folks are focused on this deficit model of disability, they just focus on what's broken, you know, and I think that's embedded in the shame and all that part that Gail was talking about, and educating more people, just as Kat said, and I think Julia, really need to track. Everyone says such great thing about educating faculty. We need to educate supervisors and all the gatekeepers across campus about the social and cultural models of disability in order to value our perspectives as enhancing the community. And that relates to the second point I want to make, which also ties what folks have said about making accommodations not reactive, but from the start. A really interesting thing happens when disabled faculty are in charge of classrooms and laboratories and meeting spaces. They start to what we call crip those spaces. Crip is slang for disabled. And by cripping those spaces, they basically make those spaces, those classrooms, those labs, those meetings accessible to themselves and accessible to others, and start to kind of disrupt our normal or expected way of doing things. It's a really sort of a radical act in that. And I can give an example. I'll give a very specific example. There's a very small example. There's so many ways one can crip the classroom. But in my own class, when I was a student in engineering and science, professors or instructors would face the board and write equations and keep talking. As they did that, of course, I don't know what they were saying. So myself as an instructor, when I go to write an equation on the board, I face the board, write the equation, stop talking, then turn around and I resume talking. So students sometimes have to adjust to this because they're used to 50 minutes of solid patter. And in my classroom, I'm quiet when I write on the board, then I turn around and then I describe in words what I wrote on the board and then move on. And I basically cripped that by saying in words what I just wrote, by stopping. I've slowed down the pace of instruction, but I've also just changed the way I teach. And I think that that's one example. I do lots of other things too. When students ask a question, I walk right up to them so I can speech read, but I'm also connecting to them when I do that too. And in lots of other ways, just like when Kat sits at her poster and presents from there, she's basically cripping that research space by saying, I can be an expert on this and be sitting at the same time. And I really want the university to see that and recognize that, support that, and learn from it, right? Think of all the abled folks who could learn from us better ways to provide inclusive classrooms, to provide inclusive meetings and research labs and academic spaces, if they were to watch what we're doing and learn from the ways that we're modifying our environments. So I really feel like there's a little bit of a sense of the university provides to us that fits in that deficit model. But if we shift that around and see disability in this cultural and social model, we have a tremendous amount of innovation that we do on a day-to-day basis that the university and all of abled academics could learn from.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll move on to our final question. Just a reminder for our participants, you can go ahead and start posting your questions to the Q&A board. And after this question, we'll take a brief pause and let you take a break, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. But you can also follow up with your questions during that time. And then for the last half hour or so, we'll be answering your questions. So the final question, I'll start with you, Julia. How might a disability cultural center change the lives of students, faculty, and staff on campus?
I definitely think that we should have a disability cultural center because, and drawing from my experience as someone that comes from like a multi-ethnic background, for example, having a space where I could connect with other like Chinese and Persian people about like our shared experience and the way we experience our culture in America has been hugely beneficial to me. And especially when I consider what having the Disability Culture Club has meant for me as a disabled person, I think that having dedicated space is not only a way for disabled faculty, students, and staff to feel like they matter, but also at the same time, it's sending a message that like the disabled community is very much like a cultural group that must be recognized. And we have this space here as a way of showing that to the world. And I think really once we, hopefully, if we do have a disability cultural center, perhaps UMass will finally be more willing to recognize the disabled community and again, like make it more into a mainstream disability diversity conversation.
Great, thank you. Maya, do you have anything to add to that? Take your time.
Through all of my advocacy work, there's one thing that I always like to say. With appropriate awareness and understanding comes acceptance and inclusion. And so I think having a space where disabled students, disabled faculty, everyone can have that important connection like Julie was talking about. It can also be another space for other able students to recognize and be like, oh, hey, here's this space, here's all these cool people. Maybe I can interact, maybe I can learn and be more opening, welcoming, and accepting. And one other thing that I wanted to touch on that I actually should have mentioned with the other questions, over this last semester, I have come across a number of other students who have come across temporary disabilities, short-term disabilities, a disability that started in the middle of the semester. I don't know what it's going to look like in the future, but a common theme with every single one of those individuals that I talked to was they were unaware of their rights with regards to their disabled experience. They were unaware of the accommodations that they could legally receive, and they were completely unaware of all of the support services around campus. And so I think having a space for culture, community, recognition, education, but also more emphasis on spreading information about what is available that will help improve the climate about disability on campus, that will support disabled students better, and also provide more ease of access when transitioning from being able to disabled. Because right now, if you become disabled when you're an adult, you're kind of on your own.
Great, thank you. Would any other panelists like to answer that question?
I'll just say one thing that I echo what everybody else has said, and I agree. And I think there's so much intersectionality that I think we haven't necessarily touched upon yet that Julia mentioned. And I think there are a lot of representation in media tends to be white cisgendered or centered voices instead of the actual statistic, which is that disabled people are a very diverse population of people as well. And I think if we had an actual center, it would be amazing to see the the actual like diversity that we have on campus within our disabled population. I think that'd be a beautiful thing, and it makes me very excited. And I echo what Julia said. It's wonderful to meet other disabled people, especially that are also from your culture, because it's one thing to just meet someone else that's Chinese or someone else that's half Chinese, but it's another thing to meet somebody that is also autistic or also disabled, because that means something totally different in that space with your family, with one side, with another side. And that can affect students and faculty and staff in their everyday lives, and to have a centered space where they work or live or go to school would, I think, be a wonderful safe space that we could maintain and perhaps have possibly more funding for, because it's a physical space. Perhaps that might trigger a little bit more support and funding.
Thanks, Kat. Anyone else want to comment on the idea of a cultural center? Okay. So we will now take a 5-minute break, so you can type your questions into the Q&A. We'll be reviewing those and asking them of our panelists. Feel free to also go to the restroom, like I said. So we will come back at 8:07. Thank you. And we'll get started with our Q&A. Oh, it just switched position on me. Sorry about that. All right, if you could create an action plan for the campus, what would be the top 3 things you would implement? Secondly, how long do you think this should take? Anyone want to volunteer to start with that before I call you out? Maya.
Hi, Maya speaking. I sort of already have some plans in the works for an action plan with some of the pre-existing establishments on campus, and anyone who is interested in participating, I would love to have whatever support you can offer. But I was thinking some sort of campaign for accessibility to raise awareness for the general student population and faculty about the need for an increase for access, because if you're unaware that there's a problem, you're not going to do anything to change the problem. And so that awareness of what the problem is, but then also giving more information about what is actually needed, so that way people can be like, hey, there's this issue and here are some options that can be done. And so I think getting more awareness to the problem will also put pressure on the administration maybe to have a bit more interest and priority in terms of access. And then some of the top three most important things I would say are physical access, removing physical access barriers across campus, making buildings accessible, making dorms accessible. I know there are financial limitations based on older buildings and all those different things. Yes, there are reasons, but there is no excuse to do the bare minimum. We can do better than the bare minimum. Disabled students deserve better than the bare minimum. So increasing physical access, and then back to the climate on disability, having discussions with professors, but also putting a lot of emphasis on the importance and legal statute of what our accommodations are, because I've heard from pretty much every single person who's working with disability services that at least one of their professors has disregarded their accommodations, denied an accommodation, given a substitute that was not actually functional, or has outed the student and their disabled experience to the entire class with no permission. And so understanding that privacy, understanding the importance, and understanding how ableism ties into that is the next important thing. And then the third thing that needs to change, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but that's where I'd like to start, and I'd love to pass it off to the next person because it takes a community.
Any other volunteers? Well, Maya, you mentioned something about knowing your rights, and we have another question related to that. No pressure to answer. I'll open it up for anyone. Are there resources available to people who need to advocate for access? Is there a way, for example, to use Section 504 or the ADA to gain your legal rights to access aside from litigation? Any instrument on campus or resource off campus for you to use to help you assert your rights? Maya.
As for on-campus resources, there's disability services. I've heard of students not being able to receive adequate support because there's just so many things happening. Things can get dropped sometimes or overwhelmed. So there is the Dean of Students office, which can communicate with disability services and also directly to your professors. On top of that, there's the Ombudsman office. I may have said that wrong, but their role is to help with student faculty interactions and help students navigate that process. There is also the Student Legal Services Office on campus. I know you said you're not interested in litigation, but that is still an option to pursue. And then as for off-campus services, I forget the exact program that this is through. It might be through state health insurance, or it might be through the MRC, the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Coalition. If you look up the MRC and disability, you should be able to find it. But they do have disability advocates that you can be paired with. I think you have to be registered with them for other services, but the MRC does have some form of disability advocacy that can help with any type of advocacy work that you need to do.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that question? Kat?
Yeah. So yes, echo that. As well as, so there's also within the disability services, there is an ADA compliance officer as well, who should be in charge of enforcing accommodations, and also I think is the person that will communicate with a professor if they are unwilling to accommodate a student, and sometimes make compromises is what it's called. And outside, there are definitely advocates. I personally am a special education advocate. I'm mainly focused on transition aged students because there is a lack of that from transitioning to high school to work, but also to post-secondary education. So Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of actual special education advocates that exist for college students or graduate students or postdocs, because again, that thought within the culture of college and graduate school and academia is that disabled students don't exist in those spaces. So therefore, there is never this huge group of people that volunteer or will go through the long special education advocate training in order to advocate for college age students or graduate school or postdocs. So I myself kind of try to work in that space if I can, and pro bono totally, because I just want to help people get the accommodations they deserve. There was a point in which Ashley and I were trying to put this presentation I made, which was your legal rights at UMass and what you are entitled to as a disabled student. We were trying to get that into the first year's like seminar program that they get when they come early. That hasn't happened yet, but we're gonna keep trying and somehow get this information to students, especially first year and transfer students, but also have it available somewhere so that students who perhaps end up having a disability halfway through college can access this information. Because right now you have to go on like a search to find it. And also you have to advocate for it in the office. But just know that in college and graduate school and above, you have the right to ask for what's called, quote unquote, a reasonable accommodation, but you get to pick that and you can say why to your case manager. And typically that's accepted as long as you are already accepted as somebody that's covered by that case manager. It's very different from being in high school or being in elementary, middle school. Usually the team and the like teachers that would tell you what you can have. Usually in a space of being a student who's a college student or a graduate student, you get to make that decision for the most part. But sometimes you can meet opposition depending on who you're working with. So hopefully there's more advocates in the future. I hope they become more available for college students and above.
Thank you. The next question, wondering if any of the students, undergrad or grad, have taken online courses and how those compared to in-person in terms of universal design and supports. How about Julia? Would you like to answer that? Have you taken any online courses?
Oh, yes, I have indeed. And for the most part, I've found them to be more accessible just because of how some of them didn't necessarily require like synchronous attendance. And as someone that deals with chronic pain a lot, sometimes I can't really muster up the strength to go to a physical class, like somewhere outside in a building. So for that reason alone, I did find it to be a lot more accessible.
Great. Do any of the other students want to share their perspectives on online courses?
Ashley, I think Michelle had their hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It blends in with your background. I didn't see you.
So go ahead and answer this one, and then I'd love to go back and revisit something on the previous question.
Oh, Maya.
I found that online classes tend to be a lot more accessible for me personally. Some days I literally cannot get out of bed, so there's that option. And then on top of that, you also can have the option to put captions on lectures, especially if you're watching them after, then they can edit the captions. And I found the transcripts to be extremely useful. And then also just having the ability to slow things down, rewind things, or like put it on a faster or slower speed. That just gives a lot more diversity in terms of options. And so when we're back on campus, there's currently not the option to have remote classes for all of the classes, which has made things a lot more difficult for me. So I'm a very strong advocate for having hybrid sessions because I do know that there are benefits to being in person, but also a lot of benefits to being remote.
Great. Thank you. And sorry about that, Michelle. We'll come back to you.
So yeah, I was going to tag on to what Kat said. just to add that grad students are also part of a union, and we are a highly unionized campus. The staff are in unions, the faculty are in unions, the librarians are in unions, the grad students are in unions, and they can be really powerful advocates in many cases for getting accommodation without necessarily slamming down ADA. In my own experiences, when I have mentioned to people, hey, you're in violation of the ADA, that's saying that phrase sometimes shut down conversation. People just get so afraid that you're about to sue them that they freeze, and suddenly things get really complicated. So I don't necessarily recommend using that as a phrase when you're trying to get access. That my experience was off campus with that at a conference, but I did want to mention the unionized nature of our campus, which gives us a lot of options for moving forward on some accommodation.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Maya, you mentioned that you would become aggravated when facing difficult situations, like your classes having accessibility restrictions. How do you deal with those emotions?
Sorry, my screen is doing weird things. Sometimes it depends. It depends on the day. Sometimes I'll just sit there and cry and be upset, and that is what it is. And then I'll have to transition to a new activity, distract myself, do something different. But then the other thing I do is I channel that anger, I channel that frustrations, and I spend my time harassing administration members and calling the physical services plant and complaining to the head of disability services saying, this is wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. So for me, taking action and trying to do something to change the situation is the release, knowing that I struggled with this, but hopefully somebody else won't have to. So yeah, it's either that, I'm gonna change this, or it's too much, I'm frustrated, I give up.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to kind of address that for themselves as well? Or we can move on. Okay, another question. Has anyone in science or disability studies encountered ableist language or deficit-based only models? How do you think faculty could go about both raising awareness that this exists and discouraging complacency? Oh, sorry, it just moved to this kind of language? Kat.
So yes, big yes. So for those of you that don't know, I also TA the autism spectrum disorders class with Ashley. And in general, that class plus just all the science classes I'm in, you run into literature that from scientific communities about, topics of disability, especially autism, and the language tends to be not great. I will say that. And sometimes very invalidating and very dehumanizing. And I think being in a space where perhaps a colleague of mine will call autism a disease can be tough. So I try to calm myself down and educate and do what I can. But for me, it's on just like a case by case basis of who I run into. Am I at a talk? Does their poster say autism is a disease? Things of that nature. Are they considering that autistic people have their own way? Everybody is different in their identity language, for instance. Some people prefer identity first. Some people prefer otherwise. So, I mean, you can be a person with autism or an autistic person, it's up to you. But typically that language like that's actually from the autistic community isn't integrated into the scientific research by the people that do that research. That's one specific example, but it's seen across a lot of disability research in general. And you will get into that if you are ever taking one of Dr. Ashley Woodman's classes. You will definitely get into that topic. But yes, it would be amazing if we had people like Dr. Ashley Woodman and her program in other disciplines to be able to have these conversations about language in research and language in education and what you are actually teaching students and carrying on this negative, the use of this negative language. You're carrying on that negative tradition by teaching it to students. So if they're, I don't know exactly the way I would do this, but for starters, I'm attempting to spread messages, at least to my program, so that they know. And I've had a very supportive supervisor that has allowed me to make my own presentation on being disabled in STEM and a grad student that's disabled and what does that mean. And I think that kind of is beginning, hopefully will begin a conversation, at least with among my colleagues, but perhaps could spread to other programs as well. But I think it unfortunately right now starts with perhaps an individual person or a few individual people within those spaces starting a conversation.
Great, thank you, Maya.
Just building a little bit off of what Kat said with regards to identity language, I run into quite a few people who are taking those classes. I have not personally taken any yet, but in talking to these people, I have been corrected by them with regards to how I refer to myself about my disability. I am disabled. I am autistic, and I respect that other people are people with disabilities and are people with autism. But when I'm told, no, you're not disabled, you can't say that, that's telling me you think disability is a bad word and you're just falling into all of the stigma around disability and that ableism. And a lot of those students were saying, oh, well, our professors and our textbooks were saying it's person first identity language. And so I think with the advocacy work that I've been doing online, the general consensus that I've seen is identity first language, but people identify in both groups. And I would love to see textbooks moving towards, and professors in academia moving towards, what does the person identify as? What do they feel most comfortable with? And I think that would be making that the standard, making the discussion known that this is a personal identity. People are going to have different preferences and different comfort levels. It is not a one size fits all, because the disabled community is so big and diverse and everyone has their own opinions, because we have individuality that is also overlooked. And I think that discussion, that transition with how we talk about identity language could be really important for building a foundation of understanding what it actually means to be disabled and how people identify and connect to that aspect of their identity.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. Just for clarification, those were definitely not my students asking me that. But I think this is a topic we've brought up in a number of different ways. The ways that faculty members are talking about disability, it trickles down to students. And again, we could be perpetuating ableist ideas. A lot of really wonderful comments here on the Q&A board, and I'm just searching for maybe one or two additional questions that we can answer. Here we go. For those of you who identify as neurodiverse, how did you learn what neurodiversity was? And at what point did you begin identifying with this term? Great, Julia.
So I identify as neurodiverse, and the way that I found out about that term, and really just ableism itself, surprisingly came from my high school debate career. I came across an article about ableism, and then subsequently when I received my first, I believe it was my mental health diagnosis, I began to identify as neurodiverse.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to answer this question? Kat?
Yeah, I think I started to identify as neurodiverse a long time ago. I was diagnosed with learning disabilities and extreme OCD and extreme generalized anxiety disorder when I was 11, and pretty severe depression. So I think I kind of identified with that term when it became known to me on social media. And it didn't really, I think I always understood the concept of it. And I think it was something I attached myself to as a part of my identity because I didn't understand how to explain it to people otherwise without giving away too much. And then I was diagnosed last November formally with autism, support level 1, and kind of knew for a few years after taking the autism spectrum disorders class. And that officially was when I started using that term formally, and then also using the term autistic as well. And it's been, I think it's opened up a lot of communities for me online, especially. A lot of communities are using that language now. It makes it easier to be able to search for communities that way as well. So it's been a very positive experience identifying that way.
Thank you so much. And kind of connected to that, and Maya, I'm going to jump to you as well. If you could add, in addition to what you were about to say, one question is, how can we follow and amplify and collaborate in your social media activism? So Maya, that was for you.
I started identifying as neurodiverse, same as Kat, when I learned that the word existed on the internet. I've had neurodiverse diagnoses my entire life, and it's just kind of been building and adding to the pile. And so as I recognize and learn more about myself, it's like, oh, okay, like this specific part, this community, I can learn so many different things. Like when I learned that I was autistic, like being on Autist Talk and learning what all the different coping skills were, it's like, oh wait, I can just stim, and then like my feelings and want to self-harm can like go away. Like it just takes a little stimming. That's all I need to do. Like it's so relieving to find people who relate and can explain those internal emotions and different things that I was just dealing with and thought was just normal and part of me. But then seeing these other people, like, oh wait, you feel that too. But there's also something that you can do about it. It's mind blowing. So that's exciting. And as for platforms and engagement, I guess like if you want to follow my platforms, that would be great, and interacting with the content so more people are likely to see it. If there's content that resonates with you and you think is important, sharing it so that way more people can learn from it. And my platforms are, I'm a roll with it, both on TikTok and Instagram. That's IMMAROLLWIT. I'm a roll with it, 2 M's. That's what people just get tripped up on. I think, yeah, that's where I'm currently at. Oh, and if you want to sign a petition, the Paralyzed Veterans of America Association has a petition to put legislation in to make it so that airlines have to be more responsible with disabled passengers, because 29 wheelchairs are lost or broken every single day. And the last time I flew, I was dropped because someone who was still in training was, we need more protection. So if you want to sign that petition, that would be great. And then follow as many disabled content creators as you can. Support them, whether or not they're an activist or just existing as themselves and focusing on other things, learning about their learning about their experiences, and learning about the diversity of what support needs can look like. For example, today I made an access barrier video, and I was like, this is a problem for me, and like, but like all these other things are fine. Turns out some of the other things were not fine, and I just spread some misinformation because I thought something was accessible, but it wasn't, because my access needs and my support needs are different. And so it's really important to get that diverse education and recognition to everybody's disabled experience.
Great. Thank you so much. And we are actually at time. So I just want to say thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their perspectives and their thoughts. Thank you so much for all of the folks who funded this event and organized this event. Special shout out to Elodie for all of her hard work in corralling everyone together. Thank you for your attendance. This will be posted to the Alliance Against Ableism YouTube account once it's been captioned, so you can feel free to share it with your colleagues, friends, family members, the internet. Thank you so much. And with that, we will close.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
pressing all the wrong buttons.